Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Learning Analytics from Inception to Maturity. My name is Melissa, and I will be kicking things off for us today. Let's start with some brief introductions. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, who is the Principal Learning Analyst here at Brandon Hall Group, and Ben Betts, who is the CEO at LearningPool. Ben serves as CEO for LearningPool, the e-learning solutions provider, empowering organizations to deliver extraordinary learning outcomes with its comprehensive suite of innovative technologies. Previously, Ben served as Chief Product Officer for LearningPool, where he worked to help define and develop LearningPool's next generation of workplace digital learning platforms, with a focus on learning experience platforms and the learning analytics space. Before LearningPool, Ben helped to build the HT2 Labs from humble beginnings into a globally recognized innovator in workplace digital learning. LearningPool completed an acquisition of HT2 Labs in June 2019. Ben's expertise is based in research, having previously completed his PhD researching the impact of gamification on adult social learning. Ben has authored and contributed chapters for many books, has 2 peer-reviewed academic papers, and has presented at conferences around the world, including TEDx. I would like to extend a thank you to LearningPool for sponsoring today's webinar, and Ben will introduce a little bit more about LearningPool later in today's presentation. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that we currently have several certification programs open for enrollment, including our Certified Learning Strategist program, and you can visit certification.brandonhall.com for more information. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components of our research, so if you have a few minutes to spare and see any topics on this list that you'd like to take a survey for, it's greatly appreciated. Links will be available in your handout, and you can always visit brandonhall.com and click on Open Surveys for the latest list. All participants do receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. And finally, a few logistics. To ask questions, please use the questions panel on your control bar. Today's presentation is being recorded. We will share a link to the recording and the PDF of the presentation via email in roughly 24 hours. If you would like to download a copy of today's presentation instantly, you may do so by clicking the link that I will place in the chat box momentarily. And we also have chat enabled, so please feel free to chat amongst yourselves and with our presenters throughout the presentation today. And without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right in.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And I do encourage you to take advantage of that question box or the chat. As you can tell from Melissa's introduction, we've got a great opportunity here with Ben to share his knowledge, his insights, his experience on this topic. So I definitely encourage you to join into our conversation today and ask questions as we go through this. So what I wanted to do today is sort of set the stage for Ben to walk us through this idea of learning analytics maturity, of where organizations can and probably should be with this endeavor. So I look at it from sort of this big picture. When I look at some of our research and we asked organizations, as far as what learning can do, what is it? What are the things that are a priority for learning to improve, to get better at, in order to help the business, right? In order to achieve business goals, not specifically to make learning better necessarily, but really to drive organizational outcomes. What are the things that should be the biggest priorities for learning? And here I've got listed the top 3 from that research. And this was based on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is this thing isn't important at all, whereas 5, this thing is critically important. And you see the number 2 with a score of 4, which is actually pretty high on that, on an overall average of a 5-point scale, is improving learning analytics. Organizations realize that being able to truly measure and analyze what's going on from a learning perspective is so important to the impact it has on the business and the outcomes that can be achieved. It's so much more than simply determining who's finished a course or taking attendance. This idea of really doing a good job of analytics has become a huge priority. Number 2 on this list, right behind the overall learning experience being improved. So to that end, though, one of the things that we find is that one of the reasons companies want to do a better job of improving their analytics and making learning better is a lot of organizations realize that their current approach, the things that they've put, all the things that they put in place, maybe aren't meeting the needs that they have moving forward. So we ask organizations, what's the state of your overall technology ecosystem? And nearly half say that it's inadequate. They need more help. And one of the biggest things we see as we move on here is that because you see that almost half of organizations feel as though their current technology ecosystem isn't living up to their needs, isn't helping them prepare for the future. So then we say, okay, well, what are the things that you would like to see improved from a technology standpoint? So we asked, if you're going to replace technology, right, you're going to go from one kind of learning technology to another, like let's say from an LMS to an LXP or something like that. What are the things that you are looking for? What are you looking to get? And the number one thing that companies want, that the thing that's driving that kind of a change, they want better data analytics. Their poor analytics that they have currently is what's chiefly driving their need to find something new. So it's number one on the list. And similarly, when we ask if you're going to replace providers, meaning, okay, you're going to stick with this kind of technology, but you're going to look for somebody else that provides it. What is driving that change? Again, data and analytics. We need to do a better job of being able to really understand what's going on from a learning perspective. And so at this point, I wanted to bring you in, Ben, to say hi, and also sort of ask you your thoughts. And I mean, do you see that when clients or prospects come to your organization, do they, is this chiefly on their list of needs when they come and they say, look, here are the things that we're looking for. Here's why we're shopping for technologies.
Hi, David. Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be here. Yes, in a short answer, David, although oftentimes sometimes we don't actually get data and analytics as being the thing that people are asking us for. They're coming in saying, hey, I'm not really able to prove impact. I'm not really sure what part of it's working or not working. It was an age-old marketing sort of quote to say, I think 50% of the money is working, but I'm not sure which 50%. And you kind of, which I think I butchered the saying, but you know what I mean. And I think some of the same stuff can be said for learning and development. I think some of it's working. I'm not sure which of it's working, and frankly, I'm struggling to suggest how we're having impact on the business. And some of that can be quite advanced, and some of it can be quite basic. Like I just don't know who's doing what with what technology. And increasingly, as businesses grow and merge and cross global boundaries, we see incredibly complex ecosystems. So it's no surprise to me that 40, nearly 50% of organizations think their technology ecosystem is inadequate, because many of them, it's not for the want of learning management systems, is it, David? It's kind of like, it's inadequate, but we've got like 7 of them. Tends to be that. And data tends to be a unifying sore point amongst all of those things.
Yeah. And we find that when we ask organizations, about their want for better data and analytics, they're saying they need that from a technology, right? So they're out there looking for that, but it goes both ways. It isn't just the technology's fault. A lot of organizations don't have the strategy, the skill set, the infrastructure to do the right kind of measurement and analytics that they'd like to do. So there's 2 things at play here is, do we need to build the skills? Do we need to find the technology? Do we need to find both to help us do a better job of demonstrating to the business, the kind of impact we're having? And touching back on something that I had brought up a minute ago about why this is important. Again, it goes so much. This is, to me, sort of good news, right? That I think why I recognize in the responses in the data that we're seeing that organizations recognize that learning measurement is more than completions and smile sheets. They're recognizing that the ability to actually measure the impact learning is having is going to allow learning to do a better job of having an impact, right? So we see that demonstrated in this data. We asked companies for a series of challenges, how much is this particular thing negatively impacting your organization's learning effectiveness? And we look at these two here, the inability to measure learning's impact on individual performance and the inability to measure learning's impact on business performance. Again, 5-point scale, and you can see how heavily weighted it is toward that high end, that the fact that we can't actually measure the impact is having a negative effect on us of being able to provide that impact. Because what's happening is, like you were saying, Ben, we don't know what's working and what isn't. So that often leads to us doing more of the same with the hopes that things will somehow get better, without really knowing what we're doing, or where we should be focusing. So there's a really big shift and a push now to do a much better job of understanding what's going on, as far as learning hitting the business. And when we ask organizations about the future of work, and we talk a lot about upskilling and reskilling and trying to get the workforce prepared to meet the challenges of the future of work, we ask, okay, well, what is it that's challenging your ability to develop the skills that your organization needs? And again, this is on a 5-point scale. And if we look at these are the averages. You look at the third item is the fact that we don't know how to measure learning well enough to ensure that the future skills development we need will be achieved, meaning we don't know if we're able to build these skills properly now. We don't know if that's going to be able to meet our needs in the future. And I think this is very concerning for organizations. This is a real shift, I think, in focus from taking care of what's going on today with really an eye on the relative near future as far as what kind of skills we're able to build and what we're going to do. You see a lot of talk about the future of work. I think, Ben, you're probably in agreement there that there's the idea of being able to measure impact is really going to drive what learning does to meet future of work needs.
Yeah, totally. And interesting, David, there's already chat going on around this. So Ron, just in the chat window there, asking, what are the sources of sort of standard industry benchmarks? And he got a great answer, pointing towards a good publication there from KB. But for me, you see that movement in terms of moving away from completions and moving away from the attainment of learning objectives into business measures. So time to productivity. And things like that. We all have onboarding sort of processes and programs within our organizations, but actually starting to be really driven by sales from our side. You see sales efficiency, especially when you're trying to onboard new sales reps or something like that in any organization, becomes a crucial part of how they forecast demand, forecast what's going to go on. But that same measure is equally applicable across any number of parts of the business. And you also move it out in terms of not just thinking about time to productivity, be that in a new skill or in a given skill, but you also think about things like risk, trust, things like that you start to want to measure around there. So we don't want to measure the completion of compliance courses. We want to measure and understand what the risk profile of our business looks like and how we can influence positively and make their business get into a position where they can make faster, better, less risky decisions given the data that we hold. There is just a huge amount of opportunity here.
Yeah, and I think you're sort of articulating the challenge based on that input, that idea of what are the sort of standard metrics we can use. That's kind of the challenge, is the standard metrics that have been used aren't enough. It's the things we should be measuring are a bit more nuanced, a bit more complex, a bit more high level, and also they get they start to get very specific to your particular organization, right? It is, what are the things that your business is trying to do? Yeah, they may be some, say, industry standard measures of how a business is doing, but what is it that your organization needs to be doing better, different, faster, stronger to be successful? And that's why there isn't really a gold standard of, here are the 8 things you should be measuring, right? Because it's going to get specific to what your business is trying to achieve. And just to touch on another question that came in around the data, around demographics, it's about it's over 300 organizations. Organization size completely varies. It's about evenly split between small, say under 1,000, to mid 1 to 5,000, and then large 5,000 plus, up beyond over 100,000 employees, and basically all industries. With a slightly heavier representation from things like manufacturing, healthcare, technology, but it's still a very broad brush of respondents in the demographics, just for those people that were asking that. So a few more things just to touch on from what we've seen in our research. It just again highlights where companies are and how much room there is to grow here, and how much work there is to do. We have our maturity model, and Ben's going to share with us a bit more specifics around the way they look at a maturity model for learning and analytics, which gets into a bit more of the practical sense of it. But for us, we find that most organizations, unsurprisingly, fall into the sort of bottom of levels of this model, more emerging or lagging, where they're basically doing some very, very basic measurement, completions, learner satisfaction. Not very many of the programs are getting measured, definitely not all of them. And the reports are relatively basic. A lot of them right out of the box kind of reports. And then you see very few organizations at the upper levels where they're using a variety of metrics, and they're actually using those metrics to improve what they're doing. And then, of course, that's sort of a very upper level is not only are we pulling learning data, but we're actually able to use data from other parts of the business to show what kind of an impact we're having, right? From sales, from performance management, whatever else there may be, we're able to show the impact that learning's having. So, this is what we see in our measurement maturity model. And again, like I said, Ben's going to share a more practical version of a maturity model for you. But it all starts at the beginning, right? We are asked organizations, what portion of your overall learning programs, if you look at the entirety of the things that you're delivering from a learning perspective, what portion of those are based on specific defined metrics? And amazingly, like if you were to sort of just talk about this in an elevator, you would assume the response would be like, well, all of them, right? But the actual truth is not very much. If you look at the way we broke this down, the yellow we call HiPOs, high performing organizations. These are companies where key performance indicators like revenue, profitability, market share are positive year over year versus organizations that aren't doing as well in those areas. And we compare them. You're more likely to see that these high performers are more likely to say that a larger percentage of their programs are based on specific metrics. But still, even with that, overall, few organizations say that most or all of their programs are built on these metrics. So the question is then begged, what are these programs based on? What are they after? And I think most organizations might not be able to answer that question, which is the challenge, right? Again, more along those lines, sort of on the other end of that. Okay, so what percentage of your learning programs are considered to have been successful, right? You've met your objectives because it's shown a direct impact on the business. The biggest group is 44%, say it's less than a quarter of their programs are measured this way. Only 7% say that's anywhere from between 76% to 100%, and then 9% say all. So just showing that not only are very few programs built on these very specific metrics, but then very few programs are being measured to that. And that obviously makes sense, right? If you don't have the metrics at the beginning, chances are you're not measuring your programs by those outcomes either. The last piece that I wanted to share from a data standpoint, I think I touched on this a minute ago. We talked about the technology, but I think this is also important, is that learning teams are recognizing that they maybe don't have the data and analysis skills available to them to do the kind of analysis that they want to do. Few organizations say that they've got data scientists on the L&D team, or even somebody that would be a data analyst. Some organizations have access to those skills as a shared service from other parts of the business, but few see them on the L&D teams. And so when we ask companies, what kind of skills do you see being important to the L&D team as you look towards the future of work? And by a pretty big margin here comparatively, data analytics, again, is the thing that companies are looking for. So there's this huge push, right? So technology that helps us measure and analyze. We need the people who can actually do that analysis. And we need a combination of both of those things where the tools match the skills that we have so that we can actually ask the right questions and get them answered. I don't know if you have anything you want to share here, Ben, before I sort of turn it over to you to walk us through some of the more practical elements of this, but from the skill standpoint.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. We as we'll see in a moment as I go through some of the data that we've collected as well. The skills are lacking, and we don't see a huge amount of investment in capabilities across organizations. So there is definitely a weakness there. I also think there's interesting points about how technology is expanding to fill the gap in some cases here. So we now live in a world where business intelligence tools have become quite commodified. There's a bunch of them. There was almost certainly going to be some licenses for them somewhere in your business if you're a business of any scale. Now, they're not always easy to use. In fact, some of them are downright impossible to use unless you have the right skills. But if they've been set up well for you, some of these tools are pretty powerful, and are getting to the point where you don't have to go through horrendously painful exercises of cleansing data, of being stuck in Excel and trying to get data from one place to another in order to just run some basic analysis. Some of these tools are getting to some pretty good places. And so it'll be interesting to see, as the quality of data improves, as the skill of the people in learning and development increases, and as business intelligence type tools become more ubiquitous, easier to access, lower cost, better, then we start to see that skills gap may close a little bit over time. But certainly for the moment, it can be an awfully long way from where people are in their L&D career, and frankly too far in some cases, because it's an impossible hill to climb.
Exactly. So why don't you take us through the model? And I know you want to sort of start off by letting people know how you think about this and why you've come to the model that you've come with.
Yeah, so I mean, we're a software and services organization here at LearningPool, but we're quite keen on combining both technology and content. So we play on both sides of the fence, as it were, platform as well as content, some off the shelf, some adaptive type content, and some custom content. And I think that's quite important because it allows us to get access to better data, basically. It's not just about who's launched what, but we also get into question level detail, actual engagement detail, and things like that. That allows us to get this kind of unique insight into those measurably better outcomes. That's kind of the mission for me at that point, is the whole focus of where you're going with this piece for me is the mission of why LearningPool kind of exists. And we talk about this idea of extraordinary, this idea that we work in learning and development because we're firm believers that education, learning, can have extraordinary outcomes, and that many of the folks that we work with in L&D have these stories, these anecdotes where they worked with somebody who found a new career, got a new job, did something different as a result of learning, and it's potentially transformational, extraordinary. And I think that capability to get from what could be a fairly mundane use of learning technology to something that's kind of extraordinary outcomes can actually be enabled through getting smarter through data. So we talk about this model of going from emerging through efficiency, through engagement, through to extraordinary. And the idea here is that organizations, as they get smarter through data, as they increase their capability to go from describing, analyzing, predicting, and prescribing, which I'll tell you more about in a moment, then we see it more and more that the organization is capable of doing more strategically interesting things. So if you don't even know what it is that's going on in the organization when it comes to L&D, then it's very unlikely to be having any strategic impact. You're going to be, if anything, holding the organization back. If you can see what's going on and you can make it efficient, then you can compete. But being as good as your competitors will not make you better than them. So then there's a level beyond that in terms of being able to really engage learners. And part of that for me comes with personalization, using data to put the right piece of learning in front of the right person at the right time. And beyond that, we start to see new levels where organizations are redefining. And you talk, David, about that idea of being able to take data from lots of different places, not just within learning, to understand the impact you're having. And we see a handful of organizations who are consistently capable of doing that. And as a result, they're the ones that you get good case studies on, where they return millions on investing in just a small amount of training. So that's the path that we try and take folks on at LearningPool. We can pick you up wherever you are and take you on that journey to extraordinary. I mean, I put a bit of meat on the bones there. So you think about it from delivering compliance on the next slide. Then what you can sort of think about there is that, to begin with, most of the time folks are delivering kind of seat time based stuff. You got to do 30 minutes of this, 60 minutes of anti-bribery, something on cover. And then I can describe whether or not people sat through it. But then to make that more efficient, I can start to understand, well, actually, hang on, some of these people are just passing out straight away. Some of these people are very good at this. Some of these people can be tested out early. So that allows you to build that efficiency into the program. You start to see more and more folks being able to test out or to get beyond some of these things because we've already proven knowledge. But that doesn't necessarily help you to improve where those gaps are, or to make sure that you're building on strengths, or taking on those weaknesses. And so moving from a compliance thing that's based on a once a year or something like that into something that's more continuous, based on the risks in your business, based on where you see weaknesses from different people in different geographies, dripping them bits of content reminders, gets you into this position where you can do something kind of extraordinary. For most organizations, they're constrained by some of their compliance requirements. We can't do this because we can't adapt to this new policy, this new code of conduct, this new way of working fast enough. If you had the data, maybe you could. Maybe you could move to that living code of practice, which would actually be transformational for compliance. And it would benefit both the business and individuals. Get people focused on the things they really need to focus on, get the business to a position where it can be nimble, agile, flexible when it comes to how it works with compliance environments. So like, it's just an example, but I'm firmly of the belief that we can get smarter through data. And so we came up with this idea of the learning analytics maturity model, which is not hugely original, I'm afraid to say, David. If you work in data, then the idea of a maturity model that goes from your ability to describe, to analyze, to predict and prescribe is a relatively common sort of schema for how this might work. To that, we added one at the bottom that was starting out, because we kind of suspected that a bunch of folks that we diagnosed and we surveyed around this would not be able to describe what was going on. So we put this sort of 5-level scale together through starting out through prescribe. So I'll just show you a couple of pieces of software just to give you a bit of insight into what I mean. So you're going to see 2 pieces of software, one analytics, one for automation. So when I talk about describe, what I mean is something like this. It's a dashboard. I can see what's going on with my learning experiences. Now, there's different levels to this, because sometimes you can get a snapshot that covers everything in the organization. Sometimes you only see a portion of it. Obviously, the ambition is to be able to always describe what's going on across the organization. But that's the kind of basic sort of level that we're looking for there. And this is a sort of dashboard you'd expect to see. A bunch of numbers, a bunch of charts. But then beyond that, you've got to be able to say, well, why is it happening? I can see what's happening, but why is it happening? So take this, for example. This is an example of a business intelligence tool. And what we're seeing here is activity over time. And you can see there's a huge spike in completion of just at some point there. Now, this is what I talked about earlier, David, when I said these tools are getting smarter. So in the corner here, it says analyze it, which is a real, this is a different thing to what you used to be able to do in terms of getting Excel. So if you hit analyze it in Stream Analytics here, then what it's going to do is dive into the data points that it's seeing on the screen and give you a reason. So if you go on to the next slide, it just shows you that by zooming in on that particular data point, what we're able to see is there was a 20% increase, and it's explained by full name, i.e. Gordon Barrett, Liam Carlson, Kenneth Rhodes. 3 people did an awful lot of stuff on one day. That's basically all that said. So there's no particular trend there. But imagine how long that takes you to dig back through the data to understand that it's actually nothing at that point.
Yeah, and to me, this is so critical, because when you start to talk about getting into data analysis, and companies just get started out, when they see something like that, if they see a spike or maybe an anomaly, decisions often get made based off of those, that we see this thing happen, and it may be an anomaly and shouldn't have decisions made on it, or it may be addressed as an anomaly when it's actually part of a pattern that just needs much wider scope to see, and you haven't seen it yet and you're making decisions based on it. So I think this is what we're really getting into, is really being able to see what's going on and being able to ask the right questions. And I think this tool to really uncover, okay, what's actually going on here before I jump to any conclusions? Can I get some sort of background on what's making this particular thing occur? I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally. So we default into this kind of inductive reasoning where we're like, oh, it's a Tuesday. We'll release everything on a Tuesday, because that's definitely the right way. But you can get fooled into some of those hypotheses because it fits the data that you see, as opposed to actually having performed the analysis. And obviously, the analysis, it can be a huge investment in time. If you can rely on tools to do some of that for you, to take away some of the anomalies, then that's kind of interesting. That can step you forward. So describe level 1, stuff that's on the screen. Analyze level 2, why is that happening? Beyond that, level 3 is kind of getting into more predictive stuff. What might happen next? And of course, this is where you start to become much more strategically relevant to your organization, because you're actually going to people and saying, hey, looking at the trends in data here, we can see that this risk is going to occur, that these people aren't going to complete, that this program is not going to deliver the readiness that you wanted it to, or whatever in that. And again, tools are coming up really well on this. So on this particular tool, again, you can take a look at sort of thinking about those predictions, those sort of forecasts in terms of what demand is likely to do. And we start to see on the next slide, there's just a brief screenshot of being able to set up things like alert conditions and things like that from a tool. So now you can say, okay, well, if this goes above this or below that, and you can either specify it or the tool will do it based on things like standard deviations, then alert me, or tell a manager or tell someone that something's going out of it. So the tools are now able to predict, okay, this looks unusual. I'm going to notify you that you need to do something different, or you might want to go click that analyze button and understand what's going in there, which is getting to a real level there that's then opening up the final piece of this. So we go from describe, analyze, predict, prescribe being the top end here. So this looks like quite a complex decision tree, and this is part of an automation tool. But the idea here is if we see things going out of control, then can the system do something about it? So if we see that people are not getting to where we thought they would on a particular journey, then can we automatically start triggering things? Emails to managers, nudges to participants. How can I get them on SMS, on Slack, on Teams, emails, various and things like that? This is really complex stuff. This is getting towards those upper echelon of what people can do with data maturity. But the tools are here. And it's starting to really change that. So we are really starting to move the conversation on a bit from, okay, can I measure, which is still important and still huge, into what am I going to do about it? Instead of ended up just being this totally reactive of like, turns out that was a really bad outcome. We've got to be able to do something about it before it occurs.
Yeah, it's the analogy that fits right up until you get to this level. To me, you think about your car, modern cars, and your tire pressure. And most organizations are operating at a level of in the past where if your tire pressure was super low and getting low, you might not know till you have a blowout on the highway. And that's when you realize, I think my tire pressure might have been low, when the tire has blown out and have caused an accident. Now you've got a tire pressure monitoring system that can tell you, not only is one of your tires getting low, but which one and exactly how low it is. And you can then see if it's getting lower over time, or what, how dangerous the situation may be, and then you can do something about it. But I think, as we've seen in the data that we provided, most organizations are still operating on a level where they're waiting for that blowout to decide if they need to, adjust the way they're approaching their learning.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. I've just got this sort of visual of people vaguely kicking tires as the sort of, I don't know, looks fine. Sort of pieces on it. So we encoded this in what we call the learning analytics maturity model. So this is a free diagnostic that you can take. The results aren't immediate. We have to do a bit of processing back on our end, ironically, in order to give you the result. But the output of it is a sort of 5-page report of where we think your organization is on a scale of actually 1 to 5. So we go from starting out to describe, analyze, predict, prescribe. Where are you on that scale? So there's a URL there. We'll put it in the chat, and folks can go fill it out. One caveat is we need your organization to be bigger than 250 people. Otherwise, it doesn't quite correlate to a consistent result. But we measure this not just in terms of technology, but in terms of those perspectives. You alluded to this earlier, David, in terms of people and capabilities and things like that. So we're not just measuring tech here. Tech is one of the things, but it's a relatively minor thing. We're measuring against this kind of more of a balanced business scorecard approach. Strategy. Do you have the strategic buy-in to invest more in learning analytics? People and capabilities, what we've spoken about before. Do you have the team? Do you have the skill? Are you aware from the market perspective of what good looks like? Do you know where you should be? So again, that went back to one of those original questions around benchmarks and what those metrics should be. And then technology and perhaps even more importantly, processes. Do we have the right processes in place? So we measure you against those things. It's just a questionnaire, but it can, organizations we've worked with have found it useful to start the conversation, because just having a little 5-page thing that you can take to somebody and be like, hey, we're a 2, and I kind of thought we might be more, is useful. So I do strongly encourage folks to go ahead and get yourself a copy of that.
That is
What I
excellent.
can, thanks, David. What I can say today is just to spoil the party a little bit. I can give folks an inkling of where others are. So we've been running this for a period of time now. So we've got the 5-point scale. We've surveyed more than 250 organizations around the world around this. So I'll leave you to guess for a moment. There you go.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's everyone gets it right anyway. The average position of where folks are on this scale is a 2.1. So if starting out is a 1, describe as a 2, analyze a 3, and so on and so forth, the average position of organizations that we survey is 2.1, just above describe. I kind of feel good about having put starting out there. Otherwise, everyone would have been at 1.1. So, look at how that breaks down across it. The most common result is that organizations are starting out. A number of them are going through that describe, and then analyze, predict, prescribe. Prescribe, we've never surveyed anybody that was able to do that top level systematically in the way that I looked at it there. A few people predict. It's kind of, I think it's about 93% of folks are accounted for in those bottom 2. 9 out of 10 organizations don't have a systemic capability to say how their learning is affecting the business in any way, shape, or form. But I guess the good news is, hey, you don't have to go very far to be market leading when it comes to the adoption of learning analytics and making a real difference. If you are in that top 3, the analyze, predict, prescribe, if you have that capability, you are in the top 10% of organizations when it comes to their capability to exploit learning analytics. And I think it's a journey worth going on.
Yeah. Although, Jason makes a good observation that, you look at there's a little bit probably of self-selection in the survey, that people who are looking for, to do this are typically looking for help. I mean, would you say that's correct? Is that basically what Jason's saying, is that maybe the audience for the survey maybe sways heavily towards those with less experience, right? Because they're looking for help. So the chances are they fall in those first 3, or is it broader than that?
Yeah, it's a bit broader. I mean, we think we work with a lot of organizations. Many of our customers have these sorts of tools, and we'll make them go through this as a kind of a point for us to highlight where there might be weaknesses. And it's not always about, very rarely, in fact, about tools. When it comes back to it, tends to be about those other pieces, about leadership, about strategy, about people and capabilities. So there will be an element of folks self-selecting into that and going through it. But at 256 organizations, and it hasn't changed a lot over the time since we got above a more statistically robust number. So yeah, there's always bound to be a bit of that. But I mean, look, I can break it down for you a bit more in terms of where we see things. So break it down by industry. Services was kind of top, transport was kind of bottom, but it was all pretty undifferentiated. If we sort of think about it there, I think there's almost an interesting thing. So something like retail, for example, pretty low scoring here, which kind of surprised me. But maybe this is the kind of Dunning-Kruger type thing going on. Like, retail organizations are generally very good at measuring things. They measure everything at that point. So maybe there's a realization from some of these organizations of how far behind they are because they know what they're doing in other areas. But we don't see much difference from industry. We don't see much difference in geography either. We've done that all around the world. The US, not just slightly ahead, but not significantly so. Same on scale of organizations. Bigger organizations tend to be a little bit more mature, and I think that's probably down to resources, but not hugely, not in the sort of way you'd think about it. And then we can break it down in terms of those categories as well. So that overall score was that 2.1, but then I gave you those sort of 4 perspectives of strategy, people, market best practices, and technology. And you start to see that strategically wise, a lot of people are saying this is important. And we see that a lot in terms of leadership says this is really important. 94% of organizations report at least some executive interest in learning analytics. But 70% of organizations have no dedicated learning analytics resources at all, which is probably unsurprising to anyone on the call, but is you know, it just doesn't jive with the idea that the exec says it's hugely important. So when I look at those two things, I think, you know, is leadership putting its money where its mouth is here? We say data is important, and goodness knows how many companies that I talk to, it's like, well, what is it you do? Well, actually, we're a data company. Is now the sort of thing that they say back. But are they actually investing in the skills and the capabilities, and the people that it takes to do that? I don't know. I mean, your perspective is probably better than mine on that, David, but it seems to me not.
No, but I mean, it's not always because the desire isn't there. There's a lot of different variables in place that are preventing this from happening. But that's typically what we see, is that those are the areas that are the toughest to get across. And, you know, those are the biggest spends in any sort of like L&D budget breakdown, is, you know, headcount and technology. And, you know, are we able to put things where we need to put them? And you saw earlier from, you know, sort of the skills want list for L&D, that these are some of the things that they do want. So I think this will begin to change. And it's funny you say, you know, oh, we're a data company. I think it's hard. It would be hard to find an organization, regardless of what they do, that isn't a data organization. Almost everything is driven by organization. Learning just has to do a better job of tapping into that.
Okay. So three little insights just to round us out, and then we can go back and look at some Q&A. So three sort of hypotheses that we investigated a little bit to try and understand the data a little bit more. One was about data collection. So some folks on the call may be familiar with various standards or acronyms that are indicative of data and data collection in e-learning. So one is SCORM, which has been around for a long time. A more modern take on that might be the Experience API or the X API. So we did ask some questions in terms of technology, in terms of whether folks had adopted a standard way of collecting data about their e-learning. So do you use SCORM? Do you use X API? And then we correlated that back against the score. So for those organizations who are not using those sorts of standards, they do tend to score worse on the maturity model. 76% of organizations who don't use a standard like SCORM are at level 1 starting out. So we do see that folks who have some level of rigor in the way they go about collecting data, it's indicative of people who are a little bit further up the chain.
Yeah, and this is a critical point, I think, for when we talk about collecting data from other parts of the business as well and using them, that organizationally there has to be a really strong data strategy, and that it has to matter how data is collected and stored, that, you know, something that means one thing in this part of the business means the same thing over here, so that you can actually correlate things, that, so, you know, everyone's sort of speaking the same data language. I think that's a very big sort of black hole in a lot of organizations, for sure.
Totally agree. Is making strategic analytics a strategic goal enough? So this digs into that earlier question of the leadership thing. So do organizations where leadership is really bought into the idea of analytics make it further up the maturity model? So again, we did a bit of a comparison in the data here to sort of investigate this. And so the question was, you know, do you have a strategic vision for people analytics versus your level of maturity? And we ran a kind of statistical correlation here to see that. And there was no relationship. It looks it on paper, but it's not actually when you dig into the statistics of it. There isn't much relationship here between having that strategic vision and having realized it. Now, I don't necessarily think that's to say it's not important on the way to do it. I think having a vision is important, but it's clearly not enough. So if people say it's important, it's not going to get you there. Getting that level, you can get excited about that executive buy-in. You're like, hey, look, my CHRO thinks this is incredibly important, so it's going to happen. Doesn't tend to be the case, to be honest with you. People are excited about data. They would love to exploit it, but it doesn't mean they can get to those budgets for people and technology just because they say that it's important. So then there's a final point to that, which is then, well, okay, well, if having the vision isn't it, then what is? And so we tested lots of different hypotheses, including this one, finding a business problem. Do organizations with educated internal or external customers, depending on whether you're an internal or external L&D function, make it further up maturity model was the kind of the basic. So we asked it about, the question here was about the importance to the customer, whether the customer is inside or outside your organization. Is having this level of data and insight important to the customer. And doing the same sort of analysis here, we found that actually, yes, that was found to be somewhat significant in our work here, that actually where the customer is saying learning analytics is crucial, be that an internal one, an internal department or team, or an external customer that's saying having this data is fundamental to how I'm going to do the work, does seem to be related to how mature your organization is in terms of your capabilities here. So I think that kind of speaks to me, at least, it speaks to that sort of business case. If you've got the business case down for why having this data, why doing this piece of analysis will be important, is a fundamental part of how we do the job better, then there is a chance that you will get the investment in the people and the technology that you need to move further up that maturity model. You still probably need a vision. You still need executive buy-in. But, you know, I guess I'm just reinforcing things that are good practice elsewhere, but it's the same thing we see here. If you don't have that business case that's truly centered around the value that learning analytics can bring, we don't see much of a relationship between that and your organization's maturity. So I'll just summarize those three for you quickly. Adopting a standard way of collecting data is indicative of an organization who's further along the maturity path. Not causative, but it's indicative. Making analytics a strategic priority isn't enough, but finding a good customer, be they internal or external, where the use case looks fundamental, will drive you forward. And I think gives you an opportunity to really invest in learning analytics and drive up that maturity model.
Right. So we do have some pretty good questions that came in. And I think I'm glad we sort of waited here for them because they were sort of larger discussion items. But you know, the first one that had come in was that it was around the idea that this organization, the learning analytics, have always been surveys and polls, which is not too uncommon. And so they're wondering, how do we bring a mindset shift within the organization, and what analytic tools and strategies are readily available before committing to something like a high budget LXP platform or something else. And I think this question came in earlier, and I think you've sort of talked through some of that, especially around finding that internal customer. I think, you know, for me, this is all part of this symbiotic relationship that we should have with the different parts of the business, the different stakeholders, because they're the ones that are going to provide you with what impact looks like, right? The business stakeholders are the ones that know, if this happens, that means things are working well. If we can do these things better, if we can change this, that's how I know we're successful. So that means if a learning program can make those things happen, that's how I know that the learning program is successful. So by having that relationship with the business stakeholders, you're able to get those metrics from the outset, but then you're also able to have that relationship with the business that says, well, in order for me to be able to demonstrate what impact we're having and make sure that we get better at it, I need the right people and the right tools to do that. And so then that's how you build those internal champions. I mean, would you agree? Because you know, your third point there, Ben, about that internal customer, I think that's a very important relationship.
Yeah, totally. I totally would. And I also think that you can be more experimental in the way you go about this, instead of saying, like, well, the first thing we've got to do is procure a huge LXP platform and lots of business intelligence tools. Like you fall back into that earlier trap that you talked about, David, of the kind of inductive reasoning at that sort of point. You're just kind of collecting data, hoping to see a pattern. Well, actually, if you're much more deliberate with an experiment there, that you set forth a hypothesis that says, you know, my theory is that people who go through this path versus people who go through this path leads to that outcome. So what's important to you, Mr. Business Person, is time to competence in terms of that. I got to get people from here to readiness as fast as possible. Okay, well, I've got my standard way of doing it, how we do it today, and I've got this new way of doing it. If I could just measure those two data points, how long that took and how long that took, that would be great. And if I could overlay some of that qualitative data, polls, surveys, are they ready, 360 type stuff that you might already have, with some quantitative type data, how long did it take? That would be all you needed to have performed a piece of learning analytics that says, is the new way better than the old way when it comes to the business goal? You don't have to have cured every piece of technology in the world. And I think people often think that it's going to be, I need all of the data in order to then see what's happening. And I'd go the other way around. Go for the least data that's humanly possible to prove or disprove a theory or hypothesis that's meaningful to the business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing. Without this sort of strategy and this way of looking at it, you can easily get overwhelmed just by the sheer amount of data that's available. And that's, I think, another roadblock for a lot of organizations is there's too much data available and they don't know how to make sense of it, so nothing gets done with it. And another thing that, and this is prompted by a question from Melody around, we see this pushback a lot when we talk about this, and I'd love to get your perspective on this, Ben. We get pushback from learning professionals, learning leaders that say, well, we can't do this because there are too many other variables involved in those particular outcomes. There's no way we can say that the learning program did that because of X, Y, and Z. And Melody's example is, if you're trying to move the needle on new sales 5% upwards, and you have these 3 metrics and you test that out, and you assume that everything's directly related to the training program. And my take on it is that no, you don't you don't necessarily need to come to this with saying, we know that we did all of this, that learning did all of this. But at the same time, you can't just cop out and say, well, we can't measure it because there's too many variables. Learning is a variable, and we have to, be able to track and measure the impact that it has within the context of the other variables. So you still need to do this to make sure you're showing what's happening. But when you hear that, how do you work through that with organizations when they talk about the other things that might be influencing these outcomes?
Yeah, so I mean, a few thoughts. It's a great question. One is I kind of take a sort of portfolio of evidence approach to things that says, well, yeah, look, I've got a range of evidence that suggests we have made a positive or a negative contribution here. Do I have the smoking gun? Do I have the silver bullet, or whatever you want to phrase on it? Then maybe not. But take Melody's example: new sales going 5% upwards based on matrix 1, 2, 3. And you can narrow this down a bit, that maybe learning had an impact by taking that experimental approach. So I've got control group, other group, doing it in the month of August or something like that. But I tell you what, if sales moved up 5% in the month of August, I guarantee you your marketing colleagues have got a graph that shows why it was there. In that sort of point. At no point will they pause to think, I wonder if Melody rolled out some new training at that point there. Like, they're definitely claiming credit for having moved that needle at that point. So I think there's something about being deliberate in terms of how you measure in order to do that. And you may have to start at high value programs in order to get the traction for that. And then taking that portfolio of evidence approach, that quantitative and qualitative. So look, I can see that more people engaged. I can see that the scores were higher. I can see that their managers thought they were more knowledgeable as a result of it. I did this group survey, and what they said really helped me is the learning as opposed to the marketing or whatever went on. And you're just building that portfolio of evidence that says, on balance, it seems quite likely we had a positive effect. Are we the only game in town? Nah. But on balance, I'm pretty sure we did something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is a question that, so are companies using data teams across the organization, or do they tend to have specific data teams for each department? And, I haven't seen one trend necessarily one way or the other. I think obviously the larger the organization, the more likely they're going to have sort of their own separate teams. But what I do see is that when companies do have more broad data teams that are available to the whole organization, they'll have maybe specific liaisons with each part of that business. So there would be someone in learning who is responsible for sort of translating and speaking that language of, this is what this means to us for the data team. Here are the questions we need to ask. How do we get those answers? But there isn't necessarily one trend, or that one is right or one is wrong. And at least in my mind, I think it's really a result of the organization structure and its size. But when you work with companies, Ben, what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, similar. I mean, I don't have the evidence to back this up, but my anecdote would be that in the early stages, we seem to see pockets all around the organization of like, oh, we've got a license, we've got an analyst, and so different teams have got different things. And then as that grows, there's a potential for it to be consolidated at some point. And then you end up with, well, part of our strategy is having a data lake, a data warehouse, having these analysts, having this sort of thing. So it could be that organizations, as they grow in maturity or adoption there, they go from these kind of more homespun kind of pieces, be it in a piece of operations or in sales enablement or in L&D, in HR and people analytics. And over time, as spend grows exponentially, somebody kind of gets a hold of this and says, well, hey, hang on a minute, this is costing a lot of money. and we don't think we're really getting the efficiency or the insight into having a single source of data across the organization. So now I'd like to do that. And you start to see that data warehousing thing come in. Getting the right time and input for learning in that can be difficult, because you could find yourself up against finance and revenue and a bunch of other folks who are kind of higher up the pecking list just by default in the organization for time on that particular task. So it's not always easy. But again, going back to the earlier point of, if you've made a friend in revenue, if you've made a friend in finance or whatever, to show via some experimentation that this is having an impact, I've got this data, then you tend to be able to do things. And we also see that what we're being asked to do from a technology point of view is organizations are quite happy that the LXP or the learning record store, whatever technology you have from LearningPool is there, that's learnings, that's owned, but the data is also pushed into that warehouse or that central repository. So L&D can do its thing here, and certainly we give BI licensing tools away with our stuff. That's how people working with LearningPool get stuff, is we give them the license. They don't have to go and get Tableau or whatever, they have it. And that can lower the barriers to entry, because that can be a big cost. But the organization will also want a cut of that data. So they'll ask us to push data into a standard data warehouse where other folks in a central team might look at it. That's incredibly common.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, we've touched on a few things that get to a question that Cindy just asked, actually, about, the people resources, just, not having enough bandwidth to really tackle analytics. And I think, some of the things that you've presented and talked about is sort of in pursuit of that finding the right technologies that do allow you to make the most of what you do have available from a skill, bandwidth, headcount standpoint, right? If your organization doesn't have a full-blown data analyst on staff, you might not necessarily want to invest in like a hardcore analytics tool to get your work done, because you may only be able to use like maybe a tenth of its abilities, its functionality, and you're really not getting at what you need. So it's about finding the tool that matches the skill set that you have. Sure. I think, you look at tools, like Stream and others that are now trying to build as much intuitive analytics as possible into the platform, so that what you're doing is you're seeing the level of functionality rise with the technologies to meet the skill levels that are available to the organization. So really, if you have a personnel bandwidth issue with tackling analytics in the short term, the only real solution is, okay, what's the technology that's going to allow me to scale as much as possible?
Totally agree. And we're at pains to try and make it as simple as possible, but there's always room to improve on that. There's some neat tools that we've seen over the last few times. There's a piece of technology we have called IQ, which is around analyzing some of those risks and things like that. But it's really, really tight in terms of the questions, the risk areas, and specific for compliance. So I think you'll start to see a bit of that, of like some of these tools becoming really quite specialized, because it's difficult to, I just don't have the skill personally to go and model data and do things like that, let alone the time. I need the tool to get me there.
Yeah, Ron asked a great question. As we're answering these questions, if you haven't looked through the chat, I encourage you, because there's a lot of actually good tips being shared, good resources being shared in the chat. So check through that. People are sharing some really good stuff in there. Ron's question, though, I think is a great one here. We've talked a lot, obviously, focusing almost solely on the idea around quantitative data, right? It's very important. That's what everything runs on. But Ron's wondering about our thoughts on qualitative data, right? Empirical or interviews, prioritized themes, things like that. How might you represent this? And so I'm just going to talk from my own personal experience, and I think Ben's probably got some more practical insights and experience on it. But we've done work with organizations where they've done, let's just say it's an employee climate survey, huge organization, and they go out and they have a series of questions they ask, and they have all this data around how people feel about their jobs, how they feel about the company, how they feel about management, and they can break that all down by business units, geographies, and see what the trends are. But they also asked a couple of open-ended questions. And part of the work that we did was to help them analyze the responses to those open-ended questions, which were, and this was over a decade ago. So but it was around the idea of, how they feel about working there, what they like about it, things like that. And we took all of these responses and we sort of didn't necessarily read through them all, but we use tools to do sort of like a word clouds and sort of gather things and get a sense of kind of the sentiment that's being expressed. And I know that within the last 10 years, if this is something that an organization is interested in, there are a lot more powerful, better tools to analyze free text for sentiment and for themes. And you can pull that stuff as long as you decide at the outset, how are you going to categorize that? How are you going to look at it? And then you can put the tools in place to extract that information. You can use qualitative data. It's very valuable in many cases. It's a little bit more intensive, obviously, than straight up quantitative data, but I think it is important to capture if possible. But your thoughts on the sort of qualitative end of things?
Yeah, so I think two ends to this. So where you've gone there, David, is interesting. Certainly a tool that was close to my heart. We built a tool called the Social Intelligence Dashboard, which did exactly that. So it took free text comments and tried to analyze them for levels of critical thought. And we're pretty successful at doing that. It's built into our LXP now. So when people are having comments and back and forth with each other, we can tell whether or not those commentaries are indicative of people who are potentially trying a new behavior. So I can present you a dashboard of that, which is a fascinating use of machine learning. At the other end of the scale, you can look at different methods of learning evaluation. So something like Brinkerhoff case study method, which you might not have come across, but it's quite an interesting one. So people are familiar with Kirkpatrick. Brinkerhoff's an alternate approach here, and we've combined both. The sort of the quantitative. Okay, well, look, here's my analysis. That this is done very well, and I've got something interesting here, and then use that sort of case method to go and actually ask people what or why, because that then gets into the reality of this cohort was very successful, this one wasn't. And you see, well, we had Terry as a teacher and she's marvelous and she does everything differently. And it's little insights like that you get from actually asking people something that transforms your opinion of the data, because you might have thought it was down to some other variable. You can only really get that down to, well, what variable was it? Was morale in the organization terrible at that time? And you've just seen you've attributed it to something else. Doing that sort of case study method when you've got something of interest can be a real lens on whether or not the trend you were seeing was real.
Great. Well, we've gone a little bit over, which was expected with the amount of chat and questions that we had. So I really appreciate everybody participating and asking us questions. And obviously, Ben, thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing your thoughts and insights. And of course, we really appreciate that. So yeah, I just want to say thank you to everybody. And Ben, I'll give you the last words as we just say bye.
No, thank you, David. I really appreciate it. Great insights from Brandon Hall as always. Incredibly valuable to be able to work out where you are in the world and what the themes are. So thank you everyone for your time. Do fill out that diagnostic if you want to know more about your place in our learning analytics maturity model. We look forward to speaking with you again.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks all.